There's times when I think I'm over it, but then something will happen that'll like give me a little flashback. Or someone will say something that's slightly similar to something someone has said in the past, and it'll just all come back. Oh God. If I confronted them or something like that, I used to think, oh, then I'll be like, okay, but I think that would make it worse. Well, not necessarily worse, but I don't think it'd help. They've definitely affected me mentally, probably more than I realise. Yeah.
Everybody's experience with abuse and everybody's response to trauma will always be different, but that doesn't mean you should have to cope with it alone. How do you think your past relationships have changed you as a person?
I struggle to trust a lot, definitely. I'm way more paranoid that I think someone's going to do something or say something when they're not necessarily being mean. I think they're being mean.
Do you think that's because they've affected you mentally?
I think they've definitely affected me mentally, probably more than I realise. Yeah.
Do you think you're mostly over it, or do you think it's something that is going to take you a while to work through?
I'd like to think I'm over it, but I'm probably not. So I'd say it's quite long and drawn out. There's times when I think I'm over it, but then something will happen that'll like give me a little flashback. Or someone will say something that's slightly similar to something someone has said in the past, and it'll just all come back.
What do you think could help you feel like you were over these things?
Oh God. I honestly don't know the answer to that one.
Fair enough.
I honestly don't know what would make it over, because I used to think like if I confronted them or something like that, I used to think, oh, then I'll be like, okay, but I think that would make it worse.
Do you have any specific coping mechanisms that help you when you're feeling down?
It sounds really lame, but just positive self-talk to myself, like reassuring myself that I'm okay, and like reassuring myself that like it's not happening again, especially if I think someone's being mean when they're not being mean. I have to like tell myself, no, they're not being mean, it's just your brain being mean to you.
Abusive relationships can be the cause of many long-term effects, such as anxiety, insomnia, eating disorders, or substance abuse issues, to name a few. These effects can be signs of trauma. Trauma is an emotional response to distressing experiences, and these trauma responses can make you feel as if you're going insane, especially considering that trauma triggers can be subconscious. There are 3 main types of trauma: acute, chronic, or complex. Acute trauma results from a single incident. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged, such as in cases of domestic violence or abuse. And complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive or interpersonal nature. In fact, a lot of aspects of trauma aren't directly obvious. Experiencing emotional trauma causes damage to the brain, specifically the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is the part of the brain that manages emotional responses, survival instinct, and memory. It does this to help us determine whether we should be afraid of something or not, This is known as the fight or flight response. In this part of the brain, trauma can cause overactivity. A good example of this is a panic attack. This also causes increased levels of irritation, chronic stress, and problems feeling calm. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that works to determine past from present and to store and retrieve memories. You might have heard of these common side effects of domestic abuse, memory loss, and flashbacks. These happen when the trauma affects the ability of the hippocampus to recall, causing memories to become very hazy or hyper-realistic. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that regulates emotions. The impact of trauma here is based around emotional rationality and can result in feelings like the pang of anxiety felt when mentioning an abuser's name. So when we think of trauma as a form of internal damage, it's easy to see how people may not realise that the emotional symptoms that they're having might need a bit more help to cope with. How do you think witnessing the effects of abuse has changed you as a person?
I think more about people's mental state and emotional state when I meet people, because you never know, like, if somebody's gone through something.
What have you noticed that someone who's been abused previously might do differently to someone who hasn't been abused?
I've not actually been in a relationship with anyone that hasn't been abused, which is quite telling. Everybody I've been with has been abused in the past. I think it's crazy. I think it's a much bigger problem than people make it out to be, because a lot of it gets left behind closed doors. There's not many places that seem to have the doors open to just help you out and like just have a chat to you, because nobody will ever properly explain domestic abuse to you until you witness it or until you see somebody who's been affected by it, because it's just tiny gestures and the way that they act and the body language.
Do you think being with partners who've experienced domestic abuse historically has had an impact on your own mental health?
It's not affected me negatively. I'd say it's a positive thing, because now I think a bit more about what I'm about to say before just saying it. You don't want to say something that like triggers somebody, or you don't want to, like, say you jump up and like go to do something. You can like startle people, especially if they were a victim of like domestic violence.
Everybody's experience with abuse and everybody's response to trauma will always be different, but that doesn't mean you should have to cope with it alone. These symptoms can manifest as confusion, fear, hopelessness or shame, difficulty concentrating, moodiness, muscle tension, nightmares, aches and pains or psychosis. Though textbook terms and definitions can fail to convey the impact these effects can have in the real world, and it can be harder to verbalise specific behaviours someone may have as a result of abuse. Surviving trauma or any of these experiences can be managed though. Whether someone has recently left an abusive relationship or is still experiencing negative effects from it years down the line, coping mechanisms can be used to help overcome these hurdles. Coping mechanisms include practicing mindfulness and logical or positive thought patterns. When you experience an emotion, hold it and ask yourself, why do I feel like this? A commonly used grounding method for people who are experiencing panic attacks is the 5-4-3-2-1 method. This technique works by having the person focus on things they can sense around them, which interrupts their negative thought patterns. You close your eyes and breathe in through your nose for 3, then out through your mouth for 3, then name the following: 5 things you can see in the room, 4 things you can feel around you, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. Grounding methods and self-care can be really useful for anyone who doesn't have access to therapy. If you've been affected by the content in this documentary, please follow the links on screen.